Genesis chapter 31. For you guys that have been away, I've tried to limit myself to an hour.
Are you able to join it tonight?
And I have 3 chapters to cover.
I will go ahead.
And so I doubt we'll make it through the study. And I may go a little over, to be honest. But I don't know if you've picked up on the excitement, at least that I see in studying Genesis and these stories, because we really learn a lot about God, but we also learn a lot about growth. Jacob is a man of God. He has, from early on in his life, committed himself to the Lord. That's why he wanted the birthright. That's why he wanted the blessing. It was important to him because he understood and appreciated the Abrahamic covenant and what God was doing in his family. But when we look at those stories about how he went about getting the blessing, there's not much godliness in that. It was very selfish, deceitful, and yet God never rebukes him. God works with him where he is. And so last week we looked at his having to flee, and he flees to his uncle Laban's, where God, just interestingly enough, locked him in a situation with someone who was absolutely as deceitful as Jacob was. That wasn't an accident. That was God's method of revealing to Jacob the errors of his way, as it were. Let me make one other comment about your own life. So you screw up. You get angry at your wife, or you get angry at your boss, or you do something you know you shouldn't have done. How does God speak to you? Have you ever thought about that? Does he come down on you hard? You wretched, no good, worthless piece of scum. Why did I ever choose you to be my son or my daughter, right? You know what I've discovered? God says, basically, Frank, I love you. What are you doing? I love you. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Notice the tone. Not condemning, but inviting. And God blesses Jacob. Now, as we come to this passage in your notes, Roman numeral 2, last week we saw that he worked for his wives 14 years. He worked for, he then had children as he worked for his wealth another 6 years. And that time now has come to a pass. And so he's feeling the need to leave and go back home. And so I just said Jacob's flight because of the way he handles it. Would you like to stand for the reading of the word, please? And then chapter 31. But Jacob learned that Laban's sons were grumbling about him. Jacob has robbed our father of everything, they said. He has gained all his wealth at our father's expense. And Jacob began to notice a change in Laban's attitude toward him. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your father and grandfather and to your relatives there, and I will be with you. Then the Lord said to Jacob, so Jacob called Rachel and Leah out to the field where he was watching his flock. He said to them, I have noticed that your father's attitude toward me has changed, but the God of my father has been with me. You know how hard I have worked for your father, but he has cheated me, changing my wages 10 times. But God has not allowed him to do me any harm. For if he said, the speckled animals will be your wages, the whole flock began to produce speckled young. And when he changed his mind and said, the striped animals will be your wages, then the whole flock produced striped young. In this way, God has taken your father's animals and given them to me. One time during the mating season, I had a dream, and I saw that the male goats mating with the females were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then in my dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob, and I replied, yes, here I am. The angel said, look up, and you will see that only the streaked, speckled, and spotted males are mating with the females of your flock. For I have seen how Laban has treated you. I am the God who appeared to you at Bethel, the place where you anointed the pillar of stone and made your vow to me. Now get ready and leave this country and return to the land of your birth. You may be seated. So the first thing that we notice is happening is God has been blessing Jacob such that in terms of the wages he was to be paid for serving Laban, he was to get the speckled and spotted and black sheep, and that way, by the way, those were the more inferior of the animals, not the superior. But that way, Laban would know if he was cheating because he could just come look at the flock. And then as we read here, he notices that because his wealth is growing exceedingly, and Laban's is somewhat diminishing, his sons, Laban's sons, begin to think that Jacob has been stealing. That's not true. God has just been blessing. But anyway, there's this change of attitude that even Laban is realizing there's a problem here. And so God reinforces that it's time for him to go back home. And then he talks about this dream, and I don't know if you caught it. He says in verse 10, one time during the mating season, I had a dream and saw that the male goats mating with the females were streaked, speckled, and spotted. Well, if you remember, the way it was set up was that Jacob took, after his Laban's sons had went through the night and taken away most of them, he took the rest of what would have been Jacob's earnings away, so that all that were left were the sheep that were pure. And yet God says, look, when they're mating, there are these different colors that are to be your wages. This is something God sees that man couldn't. And the result was God was bringing about a harvest for Jacob. Now, you and I know, maybe you don't, but that's all in the genes, right? There are certain gene lines, pools, that will only produce this kind of being. There are others that have a mixture in them, and they produce different kinds. And that's what God saw, was this mixture, and he was just working genetically to bring about what Jacob needed to gain his wealth. Questions or comments? Did that make any sense at all?
Yes.
So the point is that God is the one who brought about this increase in the harvest. And then we come down to Rachel and Leah. And verse 14, Rachel and Leah responded, "That's fine with us. We won't inherit any of our father's wealth anyway. He has reduced our rights to those of foreign women. And after he sold us, he wasted the money you paid him for us." The idea is when the groom would pay the bridal price, that money was to help secure the bride's starting of a new life and some security. But they never inherited any of that. And so you can see that they're feeling upset that he basically sold them like slaves. So do you want to stick around with the father who did that to you? After he sold us, he wasted our money, the money, and paid him for us. All the wealth God has given you from our father legally belongs to us and our children. So go ahead and do whatever God has told you. So Jacob put his wives and children on camels, and he drove all his livestock in front of him. He packed all the belongings he had acquired in Padan Aram and set out for the land of Canaan, where his father Isaac lived. Sounds like pretty sudden, right? That's because it is really sudden. There had been more planning, I think, than is noted here, because Jacob apparently has already sheared the sheep so that they are ready to travel. And I'll make some sense of that to you right now. It says in 19, at that time they left, Laban was some distance away shearing his sheep. The significance of that is apparently that was a job that had to be done. So even though Laban finds out about Jacob's departure, it sounds like he just left immediately. Probably not. He probably had to finish taking care of the sheep at that time. Do you guys know that sheep have to be sheared? I mean, I keep forgetting we're not. They're wool girls, and they literally got to be sheared. They get too hot. You're gonna wind up with some dead sheep. So probably more time elapsed, but as soon as he can, he's going to head out after Jacob. At that time that they left, Laban was some distance away shearing his sheep. Rachel stole her father's household idols and took them with her. Notice how that's just a side note. Just throw that in there. Why would she steal his household idols?
Possibly being bitter.
Maybe being bitter. Maybe her faith is not totally on God. Is that possible? You turn the page. I don't know. I gotta see what we are. Rachel, before leaving and quite unknown to Jacob, had slipped into Laban's tent and stolen his idols, literally teraphim or small idol figurines, used in divination and as household deities, supposed to bring good luck to the owner. By the way, this is Jacob's deceitful manner of leaving Laban. Though she trusted Jacob's God, she also was reluctant to give up her previous superstitions completely. And she thought that taking these images along would somehow help them in the long journey and in the new home to which they were going. Her attitude was little different from that of many new Christians today who are happy to know the Lord, but not yet willing to enter a life of separation from the world. I thought that was pretty good insight. It takes time, doesn't it, when you become a believer, to get to the place you realize I need to be all in for God. So, verse 20, Jacob outwitted Laban the Aramean, for they set out secretly and never told Laban they were leaving. Why do you suppose that happened? Why would he leave secretly? In the dark, you might say.
Afraid?
Afraid. He doesn't trust Laban. Laban has been messing him over time after time after time. He knows this news is not going to be good news, particularly with the attitude of the sons. So that's why I said I think his sheep were already sheared. He had already done some planning. And 21, so Jacob took all his possessions with him and crossed the Euphrates River, heading for the hill country of Gilead. 3 days later, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. So he gathered a group of his relatives and set out in hot pursuit. Well, when you consider that he's going to go about 300 miles in 7 days, that's hot pursuit. He caught up with Jacob 7 days later in the hill country of Gilead. But the previous night, God had appeared to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream and told him, I'm warning you, leave Jacob alone. Now listen, when we read that Laban makes this trek in 7 days, you can guess he's not coming with good thoughts in his mind. He has every intention, I would suggest, of stealing Jacob's flock. And God intervenes. I'm warning you. I love that. I'm just warning you, Laban. Leave him alone. Have you ever wondered if God has ever done that to people who don't like you because of your faith in Jesus? Who are egging you and trying to run you through the mud, and yet God keeps them from doing worse? I wonder. Verse 25, Laban caught up with Jacob as he was camped in the hill country of Gilead, and he set up his camp not far from Jacob's. What do you mean by deceiving me like this? Laban demanded. How dare you drag my daughters away like prisoners of war? This guy is a hypocrite of the highest degree. Why did you slip away secretly? Why did you deceive me? And why didn't you say you wanted to leave? I would have given you a farewell feast with singing and music, accompanied by tambourines and harps. Why didn't you let me kiss my daughters and grandchildren and tell them goodbye? Oh, brother, you have acted very foolishly. I could destroy you, i.e., my intentions were to destroy you. I could destroy you, but the God, this is just so interesting, but the God of your father appeared to me last night and warned me, leave Jacob alone. I can understand your feeling that you must go, and your intense longing for your father's home, but why have you stolen my goods? My gods, excuse me. Now, if you're Jacob, this isn't first news of this that you know anything about. But notice how Laban gives him this wonderful, why did you do all this? And then it's almost like he's so obviously a hypocrite, he wants to change the subject. And so he finds a rational reason for having come, though he probably could have bought different idols where he was from with a lot less expense than this whole group that's come down 300 miles to encounter Jacob. But Jacob did not know. Oh, verse 31, I rushed away because I was afraid, Jacob answered. I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. But as for your gods, see if you can find them, and let the person who has taken them die. And if you find anything else that belongs to you, identify it here before all these relatives of ours, and I will give it back. But Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the household gods. The plot thickens. Can you see, Jacob? What do you mean? I have no concern for your gods. I serve the God of Abraham and Isaac. I mean, what are you talking about? Well, probably almost like saying, you fool? What do you think I am? Did you learn anything from my 20 years with you? 33, Laban went in first into Jacob's tent to search there, then into Leah's, and then the tents of the two servant wives, but he found nothing. Finally, he went into Rachel's tent. But Rachel had taken the household idols and hidden them in her camel saddle, and now she was sitting on them. When Laban had thoroughly searched her tent without finding them, she said to her father, please, sir, forgive me if I don't get up for you. I'm having my monthly period. So Laban continued his search, but he could not find the household idols. I wonder if she was or wasn't having her menstrual cycle. But that worked, at least in keeping him from finding the idols. Verse 36, then Jacob became very angry, and he challenged Laban. What's my crime? He demanded. Why have I done wrong? What have I done wrong to make you chase after me as though I were a criminal? You have rummaged through everything I own. Now show me what you have found that belongs to you. Set it out here in front of us, before our relatives, for all to see. Let them judge between us. For 20 years I've been with you, caring for your flocks. And all that time your sheep and goats never miscarried. In all those years I never used a single ram of yours for food. If any were attacked and killed by wild animals, I never showed you the carcass and asked you to reduce the count of your flock. No, I took the loss myself. You made me pay for every stolen animal, whether it was taken in broad daylight or in the dark of night. I worked for you through the scorching heat of the day and through the cold and sleepless nights. Yes, for 20 years I slaved in your house. I worked for 14 years earning your 2 daughters, and the 6 more years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. In fact, if the God of my father had not been on my side, the God of Abraham and the fearsome God of Isaac, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen your abuse and my hard work. That is why he appeared to you last night and rebuked you. Any questions or comments? Pretty much self-explanatory, right? Turn the page.
What was C?
What was C? Laban's pursuit and confrontation. So having, let me see where I read that. Having come kind of to a stalemate and maybe an understanding of sorts, we read about a truce that they make between them. Verse 43, then Laban replied to Jacob, these women are my daughters, these children are my grandchildren, and these flocks are my flocks. In fact, everything you see is mine. But what can I do now about my daughters and their children? So come, let's make a covenant, you and it will be a witness to our commitment. I think you could say that these guys don't trust each other. It's not one-sided, it's both. 45, so Jacob took a stone and set it up as a monument. Then he told his family members, gather some stones. So they gathered stones and piled them in a heap. Then Jacob and Laban sat down, beside the pile of stones to eat a covenant meal. To commemorate the event, Laban called the place Jagar Sahadutha, which means witness pile in Aramaic. And Jacob called it Galid, which means witness pile in Hebrew. Then Laban declared, this pile of stones will stand as a witness to remind us of the covenant we have made today. This explains why it was called Galid, witness pile. But it was also called Mizpah, which means watchtower. For Laban said, may Yahweh, may your God, may the Lord keep watch between us to make sure that we keep this covenant when we are out of each other's sight. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you marry other wives, had Jacob ever mistreated his daughters? This guy's full of it. God, if you ever mistreat my daughters, or if you marry other wives, God will see it, even if no one else does. He is witness to this covenant between us. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that Laban appeals to Jacob's God in terms of making sure the covenant is obeyed. There are people around you that you are a witness to who may not like you. They may not like your testimony, and yet they respect you. There is an awareness, when they're really honest, that there's something about you that is genuine. And I think Laban knew that about his son-in-law. With all his flaws, Jacob was a testimony of God's grace. And so he didn't plan to be around to hold Jacob accountable. But he says, your God, the same one that talked to me, will hold you accountable. 51. See this pile of stones, Laban continued, and see this monument I have set between us? They stand between us as a witness of our vows. I will never pass this pile of stones to harm you, and you must never pass these stones or this monument to harm me. I call on the God of our ancestors, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of my grandfather Nahor, to serve as a judge between us. So Jacob took an oath before the fearsome God of his father Isaac to respect the boundary line. Then Jacob offered a sacrifice to God there on the mountain and invited everyone to a covenant feast. After they had eaten, they spent the night on the mountain. Laban got up early the next morning, and he kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. Now, when you do the math, you realize that the grandchildren, Reuben being the oldest, is only about 12. That just gives you a picture of what's happening. These are young children. And I would hope that Laban realized what he was going to miss in not being able to be around his grandchildren. So in your notes, middle of that third page, I have this quote, observations on Laban. Laban is an unfortunate example of a worldly, covetous man who knows about the true God and to whom a thorough witness has been given. He has seen the reality of God in Jacob's life, along with God's power in his blessing and protection of Jacob. He himself had even enjoyed many of the blessings of God through his relationship with Jacob. Nevertheless, he continued in idolatry and covetousness, seeking material gain for himself to the exclusion of all other considerations. Rather than seeking to follow the truth of God's plan as witnessed by Jacob, he merely resented and coveted the blessing of God on Jacob. He finally ended up with neither. His life constitutes a sober warning to many semi-religious and fundamentally self-worshiping and self-seeking men and women today. And now Laban passes off the scene. The story goes in another direction. Because having fled from Laban, what faces Jacob now? What lies immediately in his future?
His brother.
His brother. And his name is Esau. And 20 years earlier, he had threatened to murder Jacob, for which reason Jacob fled for his life. Apparently, there's been no communication from that day forward. He does not know whether Esau is still full of anger. He has not heard from his mother, who said, when Esau calms down, I will write to you and you can come home. 20 years is a good while. So he's dealt with Laban, and now there's Esau. Questions or comments? Moving right along. Verse 1, as Jacob started on his way again, angels of God came to meet him. When Jacob saw them, he exclaimed, "This is God's camp." So he named the place Mahanaim. Do you have any ideas of why angels would meet Jacob at this point? Wouldn't they be a message from God that God has his back? And notice these angels are camping. They're not, they're around. They're not just showing up for a moment. I think God did this to reassure Jacob that he was keeping his promise, that he really had nothing to fear. But that's easier said than done, isn't it? You and I have the promises of God, but how often do we ignore those promises and worry and fret when we could just trust? We're so human. So we read in verse 3, then Jacob sent messengers ahead of his brother Esau to his brother Esau, who was living in the region of Seir in the land of Edom. He told them, give this message to my, notice the words, give this message to my, what? Master? Or Lord, you might have. Give this message to my master, Esau. Humble greetings from your servant Jacob. From who? Your brother who screwed you. No. From your brother who has been humbled. Until now I have been living with Uncle Laban, and now I own cattle, donkeys, flocks of sheep and goats, and many servants, both men and women. I have sent these messengers to inform my lord of my coming, hoping that you will be friendly to me. No doubt, Jacob wanted Esau to know that he was not coming after Esau's wealth. He was not coming in that posture. Yes, plenty. That's not a fear for Esau to entertain. Verse 6, after delivering the message, the messengers returned to Jacob and reported, "We met your brother Esau, and he is already on his way to meet you with an army of 400 men." Do you think Esau trusts his brother? Well, he remembers the history. And I would say no. But we'll discover he really doesn't have evil intentions. But when you can't trust someone, it doesn't hurt to be prepared. I think it's kind of his attitude. Verse 7, Jacob was terrified at the news. Remember, all he's thinking is, my brothers are going to kill me. He divided his household along with the flocks and herds and camels into two groups. He thought, if Esau meets one group and attacks it, perhaps the other group can escape. Then Jacob prayed. When you find yourself in a hard spot, what do? Pray. Pray. He does the right thing. Then Jacob prayed, "O God of my grandfather Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, you told me, return to your own land and to your relatives, and you promised me, I will treat you kindly." Verse 10, I am not worthy of all the unfailing love and faithfulness you have shown to me, your servant. Remember, I said that we see in the life of Jacob how God is working in his life. I would suggest to you that Jacob has come a long way. He is recognizing his unworthiness, whereas before he was determined to get his own way. He had a right to the blessing and the birthright. I am not worthy of all the unfailing love and faithfulness you have shown to me, your servant. When's the last time that you prayed and acknowledged to God how unworthy you are? And yet, at the same time, give him praise that he loves sinners like you and me. It's a good habit to get into. When I left home and crossed the Jordan River, I owned nothing except a walking stick. Now my household fills 2 large camps. O Lord, please rescue me from the hand of my brother Esau. I am afraid that he is coming to attack me, along with my wives and children. But you promised me, I will surely treat you kindly, and I will multiply your descendants until they become as numerous as the sands along the seashore, too many to count. Now notice when Jacob is praying, he humbles himself, and then you know what he does? He speaks to God about God's promises to him. He's praying God's words back to him. I'm counting on you because you promised. Not because I'm worthy. I don't deserve it. But your reputation is at stake. You said you'd do thus and so. Humanly speaking, it doesn't look good. I'm praying, Lord, for you to intervene and keep your word. Comments? Just check in every now and then, make sure you're with me. Okay, 13, Jacob stayed where he was for the night. Then he selected these gifts from his possessions to present to his brother Esau: 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys. Now this gives you an idea that Jacob is not poor. When you can give a gift of 580 animals at the drop of a hat and not be destroyed in the giving, you're doing all right. He's doing all right. Verse 36, he divided these animals into herds and assigned each to different servants. Then he told his servants, "Go ahead of me with the animals, but keep some distance between the herds." He gave these instructions to the men leading the first group. "When my brother Esau meets you, he will ask, 'Whose servants are you, and where are you going? Who owns these animals?' You must reply, 'They belong to your servant, Jacob, but they are a gift for his master, Esau. Look, he is coming right behind us.'" Jacob gave the same instructions to the second and third herdsmen and all who followed behind the herds. "You must say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and be sure to say, 'Look, your servant Jacob is right behind us.'" Jacob thought, "I will try to appease him by sending gifts ahead of me. When I see him in person, perhaps he will be friendly to me." So the gifts were sent on ahead, while Jacob himself spent that night in the camp. Now here's one of those stories that you will hear about the rest of your life. Jacob wrestles with God. During the night, Jacob got up, took his 2 wives, his 2 servants' wives, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River with them. After taking them to the other side, he sent over all his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp. And a man came. So I'm thinking what happened is he brought his family over, and then he went back, and then he had all the other stuff brought over, and that leaves him in the camp. I think that's the way that unfolds. Verse 24, this left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. Now, it's interesting to me that in this encounter, which we will learn is none other than he's wrestling with God, we don't get any build up to this. There's no explanation. There's no interpretation. Jacob is in a transition in his life. He is dependent on God. He has gotten alone with God. And a man shows up and they start wrestling. I mean, would you have done this if you were God? What's he trying to accomplish? It gets a little stranger. Came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Now, did I read that right? He's wrestling with God, and God says, I see I'm not going to win this one. So he takes his finger and he goes, and for the rest of his life, Jacob Probably his hip. I don't know why. Will walk with a limp. What did he do? Just touched him. What do you mean? He couldn't win. Let me ask you a question. Why was God wrestling with Jacob? For God's good or for Jacob's?
I would say for Jacob's betterment, but it doesn't seem like that possible right now, but more than likely to better him which way that it is.
It's obviously not God who's weak. And I think there's a lesson to be learned here that we need to listen for. Do you wrestle with God? Are there things in your life that you don't understand? And you go to the Lord and you wrestle with Him and you don't get satisfaction? And so you keep wrestling and you keep hanging on to the promises of God? But He's not answering. So you hang on. And somehow, miraculously, if I can put it that way, in the process, while the flesh is tempted to give up, maybe quit, in the spirit, you become even more persistent because of the promises of God and the character of God and your understanding of God's faithfulness. So I think what we see acted out here physically is what we go through spiritually. And the challenge for us is to be persistent. That actually takes us back to the passage I read before this study from Matthew 7. Keep seeking, keep knocking, keep asking. Don't give up. Don't quit. And then God touched him, which would have revealed to him that though I'm winning the wrestling match, not really. God is God. So if we keep reading, then the man said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." Again, I don't know the significance of that. I don't think God's afraid of sunlight or anything like that. But I think it's his way of saying our work here is done. Almost. Almost. But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Now, what has happened with Jacob? He's been in this wrestling match. He has been hurt, injured, and yet he insists on hanging on. Why? Why not run? Why not say gladly? Again, brothers and sisters, in the struggle that we would never choose to be in, there's something that's real. And Jacob has realized that this is none other than God. And he's crying out to God, "Bless me." He's saying to God, "I need your blessing. I need it, Lord. I want it. Don't leave me without blessing me." So God asked him, "What is your name?" the man asked. He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob. What does Jacob mean? Deceiver. The man told him, from now on you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Israel means prevailing. You have prevailed and won. In your notes on page 3, the bottom of the page, the sighting of angels. The sighting of angels. And then C is the prayer of distress. He remembers God's promises. He humbles himself. He specifically prays protection. He reminds God of his promises. That's a good prayer. And then down at the bottom, note the relationship between strategy and prayer. Jacob made plans and then he prayed. And then he planned and he prayed. And then he plans. That's a good way, you know. I don't have time to go into that much, but. And then Jacob wrestles with God, and then this quote, before he pronounced the blessing, the angel, to show the transition between Jacob's time of preparation and his time of fulfillment, called attention to his name. Jacob, by asking him to state it, his name Jacob, by asking him to state it, he is no longer to be the deceiver, but the prevailer. The name Israel, which Jacob received that night, and has continued to be the name of his descendants for 3,700 years, means one who fights victoriously with God. It has also been rendered a prince with God, since it is derived from the two words Sarah El, with the word Sarah meaning fight or rule as a prince. It is the word which in this verse is translated as, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Now think of this, Jacob, who basically we could say has somewhat of a notorious reputation, has just been renamed by God with a name that will stick with God's people of the Abrahamic covenant for the rest of time. This is a significant blessing. Questions or comments?
I think it's shows like the transition spiritually, you know, with his name, and then like so far, like I'm not like one thing I keep thinking about, like this whole thing with Jacob is like in James when it talks about like when you have trials, like you know, be thankful to God because it's gonna change you, and that's what's been happening to Jacob through this whole thing, dealing with Laban and everything with his family and everything. It changed him for the better to be closer to God.
Yeah.
And even, you know, his prayers and how he's able to endure when he's like wrestling with God. Beforehand, you figure before everything that he's gone through, he might have gave up. He might not even had, you know, or wanted to fight.
Yeah. But
now at this point, there's been that whole transition of all the trials he's been through and the things he's endured, to where there's that transition physically, but then mainly spiritually.
I think if we were thinking of Jacob earlier, instead of remaining alone with God, he would have wanted to be in the front trying to figure out how he was going to make this thing work with his brother. Instead, he purposely calls on God. And that's progress. So after this event, we read in verse 29, please, Jacob says, tell me your name. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. And then apparently he leaves. Verse 30, Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. The sun was rising as Jacob left Peniel, and he was limping because of the injury to his hip. Even today, the people of Israel don't eat the tendon near the hip socket because of what happened that night when the man strained the tendon of Jacob's hip. Now, if you wondered whether this was just an angel or indeed the Lord, there's a reference in Hosea, which says, even in the womb, Jacob struggled with his brother. When he became a man, he even fought with God. Yet he wrestled with the angel and won. He wept and pleaded for a blessing from him. Then at Bethel, he met God face to face, and God spoke to him. In the whole Bible and throughout history, there's only one man who ever wrestled with God physically, and his name is Jacob. And I just find such great hope in this. Jacob was a failure in many respects, and yet God blessed him. And you and I go through seasons when we feel like abject failures spiritually. God has promised never to leave us or to forsake us. He may allow us to wrestle with him in prayer, but I guarantee you he'll be faithful. So, we're going to make it almost. How does God answer the prayer regarding Esau? 33. Then Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and his 2 servant wives. He put the servant wives and their children at the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. Then Jacob went on ahead. As he approached his brother, he bowed to the ground 7 times before him. Why 7 times? Because in that culture, archaeology has dug up writings that explain that if you were a king, if you were somebody, you were coming to another king and somebody who was greater than you, you bowed down 7 times, acknowledging he's the bigger, badder dude. That's what Jacob is doing, humbling himself before his brother and saying to him, in this area, you're king. By the way, why strategy? Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they both wept. Do you remember way back after that incident where this had all taken place and Jacob fled? And then we read that Esau, seeing that his Canaanite wives were an offense to his parents, he went to his uncle Ishmael and married one of the daughters. I believe an attempt to regain his parents' favor. He wanted, Abraham, Ishmael, and daughter, that's not bad compared with the Canaanite women. I think already his heart was softening. And I don't know how much earlier, in essence, and I'm never read this, I'm just making it up. from what I'm reading here, he forgave his brother. Now, I say that because of the way he embraces him. He runs, first of all, and again, culturally, they didn't run unless they were, it was unusual. And they hug each other, they embrace, they weep, they're restored. This has to be of God. Verse 5, then Esau looked at the women and children and asked, who are these people with you? These are the children God has graciously given to me, your servant. Your servant. Jacob replied. Then the servant wives came forward with their children and bowed before him. Next came Leah with her children. They bowed before him. Finally, Joseph and Rachel came forward and bowed before him. And what are all the flocks and herds I met as I came? Esau asked. Jacob replied, they are a gift, my lord, to ensure your friendship. My brother, I have plenty, Esau answered. Keep what you have for yourself. Now, why is that true? Because God had been blessing Esau as well. He wouldn't be the carrier of the blessing, the Abrahamic covenant, but he was Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son, and God blessed him. But Jacob insisted, no, if I have found favor with you, please accept this gift from me. And what a relief to see your friendly smile. It is like seeing the face of God. Please take this gift I have brought you, for God has been very gracious to me. I have more than enough. And because Jacob insisted, Esau finally accepted the gift. I think Jacob was also saying in a tangible way, I really did you wrong. I think it's a form of confession. Verse 12, well, Esau said, let's be going. I will lead the way. But Jacob replied, you can see, my lord, that some of the children are very young, and the flocks and herds have their young too. If they are driven too hard, even for one day, all the animals could die. Please, my lord, go ahead of your servant. We will follow slowly at a pace that is comfortable for the livestock and the children. I will meet you at Seir. Now, this has been such a good story thus far, right? Mm-hmm. Jacob just lied. Mm-hmm. He had no intentions of going to Seir, where his brother lived. And again, it reveals to me how God works on us, and we come along at our own pace, as it were. Sanctification or being made holy is not an event. It's not just an experience. It's not overnight. It's a process that I can identify pretty well with. "15, all right," Esau said, "but at least let me assign some of my men to guide and protect you." Jacob responded, "That's not necessary. It's enough that you've received me warmly, my lord." So Esau turned around and started back to Seir that same day. Jacob, on the other hand, traveled on to Succoth. There he built himself a house and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place was named Succoth, which means shelters. So he lied to his brother. And secondly, he doesn't go to Bethel. Remember when he had the vision with the stairway? If you bless me and bring me back to this place, I will come and worship you. And remember, we read earlier that God reminded him, I'm the God of Bethel. And Jacob here blows it. We're going to find out why next week, I think. And it'll be a sad story. So verse 18, later, having traveled all the way from Padan Aram, Jacob arrived safely at the town of Shechem in the land of Canaan. There he set up camp outside the town. Jacob bought the plot of land where he camped from the family of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. There he built an altar and named it Elohe Israel. He worships God. He thanks God for all that he has done. So in your notes, let me see if there's on page 6, at least in mine, Roman numeral 4, Jacob and Esau make peace. Make peace. And then B, the purchase of land for an altar. Since this is the first altar mentioned in connection with Jacob, it signals his commitment to worship the Lord. This is reinforced by the name he gives the altar. Elohe Israel means God, the God of Israel. Jacob identifies the God worshipped at this altar as the one he had encountered at Peniel and who had changed his name. So as we think back over this lesson, I've said it over and over, but what a great God we have. Mysterious. A man comes and wrestles with Jacob. But a God whose love and faithfulness can never be doubted. Father, thank you for your word. And again, Lord, we acknowledge that we're at different places in our spiritual journey. Some of us may be up, some of us may be down, some of us may need a good kick, and some of us need to remain walking in joy with you. But whatever our need, Lord, we thank you that you are faithful. You who have begun a good work in us will complete it to the day of Christ comes. So, we, like Jacob, humble ourselves before you. We acknowledge that you are Lord, and we hang on to those promises. In Jesus' name, amen.